Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Ben here, and today I'm going to be doing a video discussing Jimmy Butler and just everything about his situation right now. So let's just get into it right away. So if you don't know what's been going on the last couple of days in the NBA, Jimmy Butler of the Minnesota Timberwolves had a meeting with Tom Thibodeau, who is both the president of basketball operations and the head coach. And apparently we're finding out today that in this meeting he expressed great discontent with the franchise and a desire to be moved. His contract is up at the end of this season, but he wants to be gone before then. I think he wants to be traded here in the near future before the regular season starts or as soon as possible. And he's just really unhappy with the situation, and really just he's been clashing with some other players on the team, and in his mind it hasn't been working out in Minnesota. So we're left here in a situation where the Timberwolves are looking at the situation of trying to move Jimmy Butler and finding suitors for him. So for today's video, I've drawn up a few different trade possibilities, and hope you guys find them interesting, and we will go from there. So as a bit of background, Jimmy Butler listed 3 teams that he wanted to go to, which were the Nets, the Knicks, and the Clippers, and he encouraged the Timberwolves to try and get a trade for him to one of those teams. So I have included the trade scenarios with those 3 teams, but also a few other teams too that just I myself came up with that I thought would be interesting or good fits, or a few things that I thought you guys might want to hear about. So the first team I'm going to do, I'm going to do the ones first that he wanted, as in the Nets, Knicks, and Clippers, and then I'm going to get to some of the ones that I came up with. That's going to be the order of the video, just so you guys know. So starting off with, I'm going to do the Brooklyn Nets. The first trade I have here is Jimmy Butler and Jeff Teague going to the Nets in exchange for Allen Crabbe, Rondae Hollis-Jefferson, and Spencer Dinwiddie. So the Nets do take on a bit of salary here, in that they take on $17 million between Butler and Teague. But when you think about it, Butler's going to be opting out of his contract, so they're really only taking on the $19 million that Teague brings to the table. In exchange, they're getting rid of Crabbe, who's been an albatross around their necks since signing him. And really you can plug in those guys, Teague and Jimmy Butler, as 2 legit NBA players, and you can go from being a 30-win team to a 40-win team, I think, with those 2 guys in your starting lineup. The starting lineup for the Nets would probably look something like Teague, D'Angelo Russell, Jimmy Butler at the 3, and then probably, depending on how they want to play, DeMarre Carroll at the 4 or Kenneth Faried at the 4, and then probably Jarrett Allen at the 5, which is a pretty decent starting lineup with a solid core 3 of Teague, Russell, and Butler. You'd be looking pretty decent for this season. And also they'd have the cap space in the offseason to re-sign Butler to appease him. He'll have already played with Teague, so he'll be familiar with him, and he'll feel kind of good about that, because I think Teague's one of the older guys that's more on Butler's side than the Cat and Andrew Wiggins side in the locker room divide for the Timberwolves. So I don't think he'd have any problem with playing with Teague again. And the Nets would honestly be on their way to being a little more legit team in the East, and they would have a guy who got his money in Jimmy Butler and would be really satisfied. So I think that this deal works for the Nets. As far as the Timberwolves, Allen Crabbe's $18 million would come off the books after this year, so it would just be a 1-year thing, and then they'd have his money back in $18 million to sign whoever they want. They get a really good young small forward in Rondae Hollis-Jefferson, who, although he's defensive-minded and hasn't done much on offense, I think he still has plenty of room to develop and could become better in the next couple of years. And then they got a point guard that I really like in Spencer Dinwiddie, who I think in a full season as a starter could put up about 12 to 13 points a game on decent shooting, and could be a really good 3rd scoring option on a team, maybe 4th depending. And so the Timberwolves lineup with this trade would look like Dinwiddie at the 1, Wiggins at the 2, Hollis-Jefferson at the 3, Gibson at the 4, Towns at the 5, with Allen Crabbe coming off the bench for them. So I think it works for them too. This is much more of a rebuild for the Timberwolves, and in that I think they definitely take a step back for this next season, but then going forward they'd be in a really good scenario, because they would have cleared up about $40 million off their cap space between Jeff Teague and Jimmy Butler. So that's the first deal I got. I do also have one more for the Nets. And in this trade, the Nets would be getting Jimmy Butler and Jeff Teague again, along with a first-round pick. And in exchange for that, they'd be sending back DeMarre Carroll, who's making $15 million a year, and D'Angelo Russell. So now in this trade, I think the positives for the Nets are that they keep two young, really promising guys in Dinwiddie and Hollis Jefferson, and so their starting lineup would look more like Teague, Butler, Hollis Jefferson, Kenneth Faried, Jarrett Allen, with Dinwiddie as a sixth man. And so that's pretty solid. Again, you know, like, they don't have D'Angelo Russell anymore, but they do secure the first round pick, which they've been trying to do a lot of in the past year or two, is secure first round picks since they've lost so many. That's obviously what any rebuilding team should do. So they'd get some good things back, and again, like the previous scenario, Butler would be happy for getting his extension. You'd have a solid all-star point guard in Jeff Teague, so you'd be looking pretty good in that scenario. As far as the Timberwolves side, but DeMarre Carroll would fill in pretty decent for this upcoming season at maybe a small forward or a stretch four if they want to go a little bit smaller. He can shoot the three-pointer okay, about 34% in this last season, I think. And D'Angelo Russell would sort of fill in as far as the offense that they'd be losing between Butler and Teague. He could put in about 16 to 18 a game, I think. He'd be the definitive third option, I think. The reason I like this trade for the Timberwolves is that they would remain youthful, and that Russell is about 7 years younger than Jimmy Butler, and DeMarre Carroll would be coming off the books, so you clear up cap space. So you would have a lot more youth on the team, and also some cap flexibility going into next year. The only problem is they'd have to re-sign D'Angelo Russell because he'd be coming off of his rookie deal. But I don't think that would be too big of a deal. I think that they could get him on a reasonable price and then have a nice young core of Cat, Wiggins, and Russell going forward, which I think would have more longevity than Butler, who's going to be 30, who's going to turn 30 during this upcoming season. Yeah, so that's all the trades I have for the Nets. Going forward, the next team I have up is the Knicks. And so for this trade, I have Jimmy Butler and Gorgui Dieng going to the Knicks, and in exchange, the Wolves are getting Enes Kanter and Tim Hardaway Jr. back. So from the Knicks' perspective, you get Jimmy Butler, you tie him up long-term with a 5-year deal, presumably in the offseason. And in exchange for that reward, you do swallow the contract of Gorgui Dieng, who right now is on the books for 2 more years at making $15 million. But in exchange for that, you get rid of 2 contracts that really are not good for you. Enes Kanter making $18 million a year, along with Tim Hardaway Jr., who's locked up for 2 more years, making $17 million. And so the Knicks, they are able to get the best player in the deal in Jimmy Butler and a really solid backup, or actually starting center, in Gorgui Dieng. So their lineup would probably look like Ntilikina, Courtney Lee, Jimmy Butler, Porzingis when healthy, and Gorgui Dieng as their starters. And for the Timberwolves, your starting lineup would look more like Teague, Hardaway, Wiggins, Gibson, and Towns, with Enes Kanter as your 6th man. And the reason I like this trade for the Timberwolves is that you replace most of the offensive production of Butler in Tim Hardaway Jr., because he can put up about 16 a game, and you know, Wiggins will probably see his scoring average go up again with Butler gone. And then you also get depth and a presence off the bench in Enes Kanter, who can be a good 6th man, give you 15 points a night on 20 minutes, which is really good. And I like this trade also because you get more of a defined pecking order. On offense, you would have Cat at number 1, Wiggins 2, and then Hardaway 3 with Kanter or Teague at 4. And I think that's a big problem that the Timberwolves had this last year, is that between Butler, Wiggins, and Towns, they all want to be the number 1 option. But I feel like this trade would make it more clear where the pecking order is at, and for that reason I like this trade a lot too. And also, I don't know if I mentioned it, but Kanter would be coming off the books, so you would have $18 million to spend in the next upcoming offseason. Alright, the next trade I have is with the Los Angeles Clippers, which is one of Jimmy Butler's teams as well. So I have Jimmy Butler going to the Clippers, and in exchange the Timberwolves getting Tobias Harris and Gilgeous-Alexander, who is obviously the rookie. I think that this deal would be good for both teams, and that the Clippers would get a bona fide all-star who can lead the team, be the face of the franchise, bring in fans, have ticket sales, like that. They can be a fringe all-star team. I don't think that they would have made the playoffs, but maybe with Jimmy Butler they'd have a slightly better chance. If it sweetens the pot at all, then maybe the Timberwolves throw in a first-round pick to make up for getting rid of Gilgeous-Alexander. So the starting lineup for the Clippers would probably look like Beverly, Jimmy Butler, then Gallinari, Harrell, and Gortat with Lou Williams coming off the bench, which is a pretty decent lineup. And probably at the end of games you'd have Harrell come off the court, and then you'd have sort of a small ball space lineup of Beverly, Williams, Butler, Gallinari, and Gortat, which is pretty good offensively. There's still room for improvement defensively, but with a starting backcourt of Beverly and Butler, you could argue that that's the best starting backcourt defensively in the league. Maybe not every night, but on given nights for sure. So I think that there's definitely positives for the Clippers. And also, if you want to bring in a guy like Kawhi in the offseason, how better to do it than to bring in a guy like Jimmy Butler, who's a fellow all-star, who Kawhi could play next to pretty easily with how their play styles are. They have similar mindsets. They're both really defensive-oriented, but also good offensively. And also, that was one of the teams that Kawhi listed that he wanted to go to, so he'd have more incentive to want to go there, and thus the Clippers would want to make that move to make him want to go there more. From the Timberwolves' perspective, you get the young, promising, tall point guard in Gilgeous-Alexander, Sean Gilgeous-Alexander. And I think that I like him because he's so tall. He's at like 6'6", 6'7", and that's really promising. I feel like he'd be like a version of Sean Livingston if Sean Livingston didn't get injured. Sort of that really tall point guard who's pretty lanky too and can do a lot of different things for you. And then Tobias Harris can fill in for the most part for Butler offensively. He could probably give you 18 points a game. He actually is a pretty good three-point shooter. Last year he shot 41% from three, which is really good for him. It's his best season shooting it from three. I think that he would continue to do well in that respect. The starting lineup for the Wolves would probably look something like Teague at point, Wiggins at shooting guard, Harris at small forward, Gibson at power forward, and Cat at center, with your six men being Gilgeous-Alexander, D. Rose, and then Gorgui Dieng. So that's a bit more depth than they would have had previously too. Alexander might have to play more shooting guard or just two guard because they don't really have much of that right now. And so then they could run lineups with him and Rose or him and Teague because he's so tall that he could fit in well in that regard. So moving on from that, the next one I have I think is the one that most people would shake their head at and think is least likely. But I think that it would be interesting and might actually work well if the teams gave it a chance. And so here it goes. Jimmy Butler and Gorgui Dieng to the Miami Heat for Josh Richardson and Hassan Whiteside. Now, I know what you're thinking right away. No one's going to touch Hassan Whiteside. Nobody likes him. Oh, he's so bad. He's whatever people have been saying about him. But when you still look at his numbers from last year, he shot 54% from the field, and he put up 14 and about 11, and still was a good player. And really just Miami moved away from an offense that featured him, so he got upset. But honestly, in the right situation, which Minnesota could be, I think that Whiteside could do well there. I'll get into more of the Timberwolves stuff in a sec, but I'm going to talk about the Heat right now. So for the Heat, you get the all-star that you've been pining for the last 2 to 3 years. Butler's finally the guy that you can sign long-term, build a team around. I think that he would like it in Miami because he'd reunite with Wade, who he did decent with in Chicago, and I think he enjoyed playing with Wade. And you get a guy in Gorgui who is not bad, but he's really not the best part of this deal. it's kind of like the reason the Heat would do this deal is that they know that they'd be getting rid of the albatross of Whiteside, so they'd be willing to absorb Gorgie, who's on a $10 million less of a deal. And ultimately, if you really don't want Jimmy Butler, or for some reason, or if he leaves, that is $20 million in cap space you'd have, a lot more flexibility that you would not have had otherwise, and you would be looking better as far as trying to sign somebody in free agency, whether it be, Kawhi or DeMarcus Cousins or anybody. But for the time being, their starting lineup would probably look something like, assuming Dion Waiters is healthy, Dragic, Waiters, Butler, James Johnson, and Gorgie Jang, with like Kelly Olynyk and Tyler Johnson as your main guys coming off the bench, which is a pretty solid starting lineup. I'd say it's better than what they have this year. Oh, Wayne Ellington as one of the main guys coming off the bench too. And for the Timberwolves, the reason I think Whiteside would work decent here is that what does Tibbs love? Big defensive point guards. And big defensive centers. He loved Joakim Noah when he had him. And what is Hassan Whiteside in my book? He's a more athletic, better offensively version of Joakim Noah. He can get you tons of blocks and tons of rebounds. He's really athletic, so he can get a lot of alley-oop dunks. Sort of a rim protector that they've been missing up until now. And so their lineup would probably look something like this. Teague at point guard with Richardson at the shooting guard, Wiggins small forward, Towns power forward, and Whiteside at center with Gibson as their main man off the bench, and Derrick Rose as one of the other main guys off the bench. I like this deal because in the post you can have rotations of Towns and Whiteside if you want to go really big, and Towns can space it from 3 so that they can do this lineup. And also, Whiteside brings the rim protection, as I said, which Towns hadn't brought before, but they'd still have a decent amount of spacing with Towns shooting from outside, and then Richardson being able to shoot from outside. I think this last season, if I look at his stats, he shot pretty well from the outside. He shot 38%, which is really respectable. I think he'd continue to improve. He could give you about 10 to 12 points a game. Again, there'd be a really good clear pecking order, I think, offensively. You'd have Towns, Wiggins, then Whiteside, and then below that, like Teague and Richardson and Rose kind of all getting about an equal amount of shots. But I think it does help in that it makes a more clear pecking order. And for the Timberwolves, when Whiteside does come off the books, that's going to be a lot of money, which I think they would like to see. Instead of like 3 guys making $15 million, they just have 1 guy coming off the books at once to get a ton of cash back from him being gone. So yeah, I like this idea. I think that Tibbs could do really well with Whiteside, and that their defense could improve a lot. And as far as in the low post, I mentioned it earlier, but I'll finish that point. You could have Whiteside and Towns, which would be probably your most talented lineup. But if you want really good defense, you could sub in Gibson for Towns, or if for some reason you want to move a little bit faster, get up and down the court more, I think that you might sub in Towns and Gibson, because I think Whiteside, although he is still really athletic, he is 28 going on 29. He will be 30 in a year from now. He'll be going on 30, so he might start to decline athletically, and so you just have a few different options in the post as far as your players and the different rotations you could do with them. This next trade I have is one where I feel like it's just what the people want, sort of. It's Jimmy Butler and Jang to the Celtics for Gordon Hayward. This is pretty bland deal. Gordon Hayward is essentially Jimmy Butler. I'd say he can give you 25 and 5. He could give you Butler's production. It essentially would be trading Butler for a guy that would be basically Butler, but having already signed the max deal, because Hayward's going to be signed for 3 more years at a max deal, 30 to 35 million, depending on the year he's playing. Timberwolves would look pretty much the same. You would have Teague, Hayward, Wiggins, Gibson, and Towns, a starting lineup with the same bench players except for Jang. And so yeah, I think that they'd be about the same team, and I think that they'd probably get around the 3 seed, which is where they were at last year before Jimmy Butler went down with injury. As far as Boston, they'd be able to unite Kyrie Irving and Jimmy Butler, who have really wanted to play together the past year or two. And then you'd get a good backup center who could fill in for Aaron Baines, because he's definitely an upgrade. And Gorgui Dieng, who I think is more athletic. He can pop it from 3 a little bit. And I just think overall would be an upgrade from Aaron Baines. I don't really see this deal happening just because I feel like the Celtics are going to want to feel it out with having Hayward come back. They're just going to want to try that out and see what they can get. But, you know, if they want to get involved in the Jimmy Butler trade, maybe they will. I just threw him in there because it seems like everyone always wants the Celtics to be involved in talking about trades. And then this last one I have is my favorite one, actually. It's Jimmy Butler, Jeff Teague, and Taj Gibson to the Grizzlies for Mike Conley and Jaren Jackson Jr. So the Grizzlies take on a lot of money here, but they do get tremendously better. Their starting lineup would now look like Teague, Jimmy Butler, probably Chandler Parsons at the 3, Taj Gibson at the 4, and Marc Gasol at the 5 with that array of young guys who aren't that great coming off the bench. But you have a solid starting 5. It would look a lot like the grit and grind days. I think Jeff Teague is similar enough to Mike Conley in talent that you wouldn't be missing a ton. I think Mike Conley is better, but Jeff Teague can provide some of the same production adequately. Jimmy Butler would be the best player on this team, and he would be the definitive number 1 option. And they would just overall, I think, climb in wins and be more of a playoff contender, sort of like what they were in 2016 to 17, like a 44-win team that could sneak in as a 7 or an 8 seed. But I think people thinking that they're going to make the playoffs as they stand right now are ridiculous, but I think that this could bring in a lot more talented players for them to improve overall. And for the Timberwolves, they bring in Mike Conley, who is making a boatload of money for a few more years. But again, as I said with Whiteside, I think that they would be relieved when all of that 30 to 35 million comes off the books in one chunk, 1 year, rather than like having $10 million come off the books here, $10 million there. They just have it all coming off at once. And then you have Jaren Jackson, who's a really good, promising power forward who could slot in next to Towns. People have been raving about him since his summer league performances, and you know, it'd be getting veteran experience in Conley and youth in Jackson at the same time, which would be a good combination. Starting lineup would look like Conley. At the 2, you'd probably have to sign somebody for cheap, honestly, because they don't have much depth at the 2 right now. Wiggins at the 3, Jackson at the 4. At the 5, you'd have Towns with Gorgui Dieng and Derrick Rose coming off the bench. So really, I think this trade works well. They could sign some guy for a minimum deal and make it work, or the Grizzlies could throw in somebody small, somebody that's making a small amount of money right now, maybe like Andrew Harrison. He's a shooting guard making $1 million a year. The trade still works. He could start at shooting guard, and there you go. So I think that trade works really well in that the Timberwolves get some youth and some experience, and they still maintain their playoff contender status, and the Grizzlies become a much better team as far as talent and put themselves squarely in the playoff conversation. So overall, I don't want to include teams like the Lakers or the 76ers on this or the Rockets for that sake, because there's really no feasible way that those teams could get him. There is for the 76ers, but I don't think that they would want him because, honestly, I just don't think that they want to pay a 29-year-old the max. Because you got to think, Jimmy Butler is going to be coming off of this max. He's going to be getting max money, $40 million a year, at the age of 34. So is any team really going to want to give him who's not more desperate for a star? Like, Philly's not desperate. They've got 2 great players. They don't really need a third necessarily. Unless they're like young and in their prime, like Kawhi, I could have understood more. But Butler's going to be, if he signs a 5-year max, he's going to be making max money at 34 years old. I don't think he'll still be as good by then, and that's why I think that contending teams like them or the Rockets too are going to be more hesitant. Rockets are a no because they just signed Chris Paul to the max, and they're not really going to have cap space. And the Lakers don't really have cap space since they just waived Luol Deng. They'll have cap space in the offseason, but not for a trade right now, really. So there you go, guys. Those are some ideas I had about Jimmy Butler being traded to various teams. Let me know in the comments what you think of my ideas. I'd be glad to hear from you, glad to talk about it, and I hope you guys have a good day. Bye.